Good morning. My name is Ann Butts Wylie, and my daughter wanted to do a little life interview of me. And you know, when you're 84, it's kind of hard to remember that long life, but blessedly, I've got a little memory left, so we thought we would go ahead and start that this morning. I do not really have a middle name, although as time goes on, I separated my name and it's two words, Joe and Ann. But the I have no earthly idea why they named me that. Nobody ever told me, and nobody ever asked. But I never had a nickname. And when I was in trouble, they called me my whole entire names. I was born in Coyle County in Kentucky and was the first person in my family that was born in the hospital. They had a new hospital, the Princeton Hospital. My grandparents and my parents had lived in that area most of their life. My grandfather's parents came to a little town called Katoa, Kentucky, and they ran a little business there. So my grandfather went on to work on the railroad, and his brother went into the service in World War One, and they lived in Katoa until Uncle Ray and he started a business over in the same Coyle County, but it was in Fredonia, Kentucky. They bought two houses next door to each other, and my Uncle Ray stayed there with his two sisters and his parents. They all lived in the same house. He never married, and neither did his sisters. So Paul and his new wife, he went to work on the railroad. And he decided that he and his brother would go in business together. So they started a jack of all trades place. They ran a chicken and egg route through all the farming community. That's kind of what it was down there. And then they had a Butts Brothers garage. My maiden name was Butts. And you get real independent when you have that name, because you certainly do take a lot of teasing about it. I lived almost the majority of my life with my grandparents, but my dad was their oldest son, and he married a pretty little girl from over on the river in Dykesburg, Kentucky, and her name was Doris. And her grandfather, who reared her, she never knew her father. I think he was killed before she was born. He ran an old-timey riverboat up and down the river, and it emptied into the Mississippi. My dad had one sister and two brothers, but one of his brothers died as a child, and so there was the three Buttses, and my dad's name was Willis, and his sister's name was Juanita, and their younger brother was JC. They were always fairly close. JC was the spoiled one, they said. And I agree, because I lived with JC when I lived with my grandparents, and he was kind of like an older brother to me. I lived with my mom and dad for a few years. My dad had a road oiling company, and we went all over the country building, at that time, which were wonderful roads, but they're what we call the little old blacktop roads now that we all hate to get off on. The best time I remember living with them, we went to Florida and built some roads and some airports down in the Florida coast during World War II. And as best I remember, my mother really liked it. She liked to go to the beach a lot. I did too. But I never really remember a lot about them being together, because my dad traveled a lot, and she was just there, and she was young, and we didn't have a real normal family life, but it was okay. But then when it was time for me to go to school, we moved to a little town up in Indiana, and that's when they started having difficulties in their marriage. So I went to first grade in Noblesville, Indiana, to elementary school. It was okay. We lived in a mobile home, which during the early 40s, a lot of people were living in, because they kind of got popular, but in the place I was from, it was always you were living a transient house, so that wasn't too good. But anyway, when I got ready to start in the second grade, my parents had separated, and it was decided that I would go down and live with my grandparents in Fredonia, Kentucky. And they were very staid and structured people, not very outgoing. I don't know where I got that from, but they weren't very outgoing, but they were very good to me, and I think they loved me a lot. I was their first grandchild, but they didn't love my mother, and so that kind of created a little bit of tension there sometimes. I lived with them, and their younger son, their daughter had already moved out of the house, but she did come back to Fredonia and stayed about 2 years while her husband was in World War II, and she worked there in Fredonia. So I was brought up in a house with my grandparents and an aunt and an uncle. And next door to me was one great uncle and two great aunts, and they were delighted to have a child in the house. So I guess I was a little bit spoiled, but they believed in spare the rod and spoil the child, so I wasn't real spoiled. I started second grade in Fredonia, and the teacher was my next door neighbor, so that was kind of nice. I went to school there until I was a freshman until the end of my freshman year of high school. My mother remarried a person that was in the military, and she lived in Germany most of the time that I was in elementary school. They were based over there. Then her family lived in Dykesburg, Kentucky, which was, maybe half an hour from Fredonia, but people didn't travel back and forth as much then as they do now. So it was a trip. When she came, I'd go over and visit with them. Otherwise, we didn't do a lot of traveling, or we didn't go far from home. It just so happened that as I finished the ninth grade, my freshman year at Fredonia High School, they consolidated the schools, and of course, there was no idea in the world that I'd be allowed to ride a bus 13 miles to go to school. So in the meantime, my dad had married again and was living in Frankfort, Kentucky. And his wife had a daughter that was about 4 or 5 years younger than me. I'd gone to a school of 500 people in 12 grades, and I went up to Frankfort, Kentucky, and went to a school with about 700 in 4 grades. So it was kind of a drastic change for me, but I liked it because I had a little bit more freedom there, and I made friends fairly easily. And my dad had been living there, but he traveled, so it was mostly at home with my stepmother and her daughter and me, and that caused some problems sometimes, but we made it through. And that's where I met my husband. He was kind of the big jock on the football team, and I wasn't allowed, as a sophomore in high school, I wasn't allowed to date. So we just kind of were friends until I got to my junior year of high school. I liked the school. I didn't have any problems making an adjustment. In fact, I was their basketball queen one year, and I enjoyed the time I was there. Made lots of friends, and at 85, I still have lunch with the ones of us that are still living once a month, and we have a lot of fun, and we reminisce about all those days at old Elkhorn High School. My husband had a football scholarship, and we were going to go to Bowling Green and live, but we just decided he had an opportunity to go to work for the United States Property and Fiscal Office, which was kind of a neat thing. I worked for the state in Frankfort after we graduated from high school and married. Brother Bell married us. He was a great big football fan, and he had loved my husband, and he helped us a lot in a little counseling, so we hadn't gotten much of that before, and in just kind of what was expected of people who were married and people who were trying to establish their life. So we never forgot him. He had always gone to all Wayne's ball games, and we saw him up until he died. He was a great man. Uh, and it's kind of hard for me to talk about the time that I was there living in Frankfort in high school. I had some great friends, but I had at the time, well, I think if I had been more, uh, well, I was going to say, Helen was dating the chief of police, my dad's wife. And so that kind of created a little bit of a problem within the household and with her and everything else. And of course, I don't know that my children know this, but she was, some days she would go a long time without talking to me. And I'm a social person, and that was hard. So I really wanted Wayne. He wanted to be a coach. That was his life stream. And I wanted him to go to school so he could. But that's the best thing that happened to me in my life, was that I was blessed to have a man who always put me first, and who cared more about me than he did anything else in the world. And sometimes you have to grow a lot before you can realize that. And, we were married a number of years before I realized that. I think that I was looking for any port in a storm, and he was my port in every storm I had. I was 17, thought I knew everything in the world. I'd graduated from high school. I had a good state job. I was a proficient in my skills, and I got a pretty good state job then. And back in the 50s, you didn't really have to have a college education. There was a lot of things you could do without that. And so Wayne was in the National Guard, and they offered him a job in Louisville with the United States Property and Fiscal Office, which was a good job. And we just kind of thought that everything was in line, that we would get married at 17 and 18. Two people that had never even had an apartment out away from home, had never planned or cooked well, I'd cooked plenty of meals, and I was a worker. I was brought up to work, but I think it was a miracle that we were successful. I think it was and a lot of hard work. And so then we moved to Louisville to be closer to his work, and I transferred down there with the state. And then we found out, and we were thrilled to death that I was pregnant. And my dad, in the meantime, had gotten a divorce. My mother and I had reconciled a little bit, because she had adopted another child who was just a couple of years older than my Mike. So they were close to the same age, but she lived in California, so she was never ever part of my family after I was a small child. We lived there. We had he was born in Louisville. We thought he was the prettiest child we'd ever seen, and we just couldn't quit looking at him in the nursery. He had he had long black hair. If you know him now, but he had long black hair, and he was a beautiful baby. I only had beautiful babies, except, I don't know, the last two, they had some little quirks I'll have to tell you about. But anyway, my aunt, who I loved, my dad's sister, very much, we decided, we did all the things with a family that most people do when they're growing up, because we didn't have that background. So we sold our house in Louisville, and we moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and Wayne took a traveling job with the L.M. Berry Company, and it meant that I didn't have to work. And that's my aunt and uncle who lived there, my dad's sister. They encouraged us to do that because they felt like we didn't really have anybody up there. So we did, and it was the worst thing I ever did, because I think I'm a Kentucky girl, tried and true. And I loved being there with them, but Wayne traveled. He was gone all the time, and I was at home with two babies. Danita was born in Memphis, Tennessee, so she's really a southern gal more than I am. And she was so pretty, and everybody kept going on and on about her black hair, because they didn't see many people, and they put bows in it. And I told them, I said, please don't braid it. you'll really get us confused. But her hair wasn't that curly when she was born. And we lived there for 2 years, and neither of us were happy. Neither of us were happy. So we came back to, by that time, my dad was living here in Lexington. He wanted us to come back up here, be, I guess, around him, because we were all family he had. And he never had any other children besides me, except a stepdaughter when he married. That he was married to when I was in high school. And I forgot about Edwina. That was my experience of having a sibling. And oh my Lord, it was not a good experience. But as we grew older, we became closer, and I know she loved me a great deal. We came to Lexington, and he went on the police department, and I opened a daycare center over in the Chevy Chase area. We rented a house from a church. It was a nice house, but it was not very well kept up. But it was in an exclusive area of town, so that was kind of nice. Everybody thought we had money, but we didn't. We both worked. I did the daycare, and he did that. As the children got a little older, I thought I was better find me another job, so I went to work at Kentucky Village, which was a state child's institute out here, and I worked the second shift. So Wayne worked all the time as a policeman, and we had some real hard times financially and growing up during that period of time. But we tried our best to not let the kids realize that it wasn't the best time of our life. But then we found this little house that I'm still sitting here in after all these years, and we bought it, and we thought we were just settled for life. It was, and we've moved. We've done all kinds of things to it. We could have, but we liked where it was. It kind of reminded us of being in the country, not because Lexington was a big city to me then, because I'd come from a little town of 500 people, so it was a momentous sized town for me to be. And then, of course, we came from Memphis, Tennessee, which was even bigger than Lexington, and so it was a big adjustment. So we had a hard time those few years there. And then I went to work for the city, which was a little bit more stability than I worked several jobs, I think. And then I worked for the school system, and Marty and Tom were born here in Lexington. And but I think we always went to the Baptist hospitals, except for Danita. Mike was born at the Baptist Hospital in Louisville. Danita was born at the Methodist Hospital in Memphis. And then Tommy and Marty were born here in Baptist Hospital. And they were only 11 months apart. That was an experience in itself. It was delightful, but I don't know that I'd recommend it, because you feel like you're pushing one out of the baby bed before the other one can get in it. We enjoyed the kids so much, but 4 children is a lot of children to raise in today's world, in any world. After we moved here, things kind of settled down, and I got a job that I stayed with, and then Wayne went to the post office to work, went up to the federal government, and he made a little bit more money, and we were fairly comfortable with 4 children, that we could handle everything that came up. And he did a lot of coaching, and I always felt a little guilty, because I felt like if we had not made that decision to marry, he had a scholarship open to him, and at Bowling Green, Western Kentucky University. He could have been a coach, which was what his goal in life was. So he coached, not for no pay, but he did coach the rest of his life, the rest of his life. And he always said that was enough for him. He was doing just what he wanted to be. So I hope it was. And we had these kids were, of course, Marty and Tommy were only 11 months apart. I don't know how. Now, as I look back on it, we thought it was a real good time. I thought it was. Maybe it wasn't, but we managed, and we proved that you can get married at 17 and 18 with no money, and if you have enough determination, you can make it through. The only thing is you never get caught up. You never get caught up. If you have a few years to make some money and move up a little bit in the work world, but when you start out at the bottom and you have 6 people in your family, it takes about everything you could do. And so you're nervous about changing jobs or anything. And so, of course, Wayne, when we came up here, he was a policeman, and that didn't pay much, and it was hard. It was shift work, and so then when he was hired on at the post office and as a mail carrier, and it worked out better for us. He got up and went to work early, so he didn't have to deal with the kids getting off to school or anything. But he was always off early enough to go coach his football teams, and he had some good ones, and he was a good coach. It was his life's calling. And when people make a decision, you can do whatever your life calls you to do. It just may not be in the exact same standard that you thought it would be. But we had some rough times and we had some good times. But when the good far outweighs the bad, it's okay. But sometimes you want to skip over the bad things and just remember the good things. But there's a lot of bad things. And sometimes I think it's good for people to know some of those things, because they think, oh, well, they just had a perfect life. And, there's no such thing. Well, we lived in a mobile home. That was terrible. Shoot, especially when my mother brought them drunks home and I had to listen to them. It's what makes you who you are and what you are, really. Noblesville, Indiana, that's the last time I lived with my parents together. And my dad brought me down to Fredonia, my grandparents, which was not an unusual thing, and I just thought I was going to come and stay a month or two or whatever and that was probably the longest I had ever stayed away from them, because I had to stay up there, and go to school. And and then, well, when we all came back, really, and we moved into this trailer court, because we had a trailer, and we moved in one in Marion, Kentucky, which was just another little town in about 10 miles from my grandparents. And my dad was still working on jobs, and he had a job. He always got a job around road oiling. Is what he did. I mean, he not road oiling, blacktopping. So he was always working on jobs. There was a lot, especially up in the mountains. That's how he met his second wife. So we had a mobile home, and it was very small. And it had one bedroom, and then it had the living room with a couch in it. And it had a bathroom, but and a kitchen. And then the living room was kind of the bedroom, except I had the back bedroom, because she always had, when Daddy was gone, we always had all of her friends over there drinking and carousing, and I was afraid a lot. People get drunk, they get loud, they get disorderly, and I was afraid a lot. And so I think that's it. I think I've just told you the good things that I haven't, but everybody needs to know, because that's what makes you the person you are. What really happened was that my mother was, what was his name? I thought I'd never forget it. Lawrence Davenport was the man she was seeing. And I mean, of course, in Dykesburg, where she was from, I mean, everybody knew it, I don't know. I think Daddy knew it, just didn't care, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, they were in a bad wreck, and the car turned over. Mother had that one hand that was about twice the size of the other one. Well, that was crushed in there, and that's what happened to her hand. What really did was they had a big fight at the trailer, and the police came, and they arrested Lawrence and whoever was in there, whatever other drunks was in there. But they didn't arrest Mother because I was there. And back then, people kind of tried to take care of families, even if it wasn't good. And that's the last time that I stayed in the trailer, because that's when Daddy found out they had been the big hoop-de-loo, because it was in his name, and he had rented the place in his name. And I think they were basically separated then, but he would still come home, but he didn't stay with us. But they weren't divorced or anything. So anyway, but they had this big confrontation over there, and two of the guys, or maybe three of them, were arrested. And they drank a lot. She drank up till the day she died. But anyway, but it wasn't unusual that the next day she takes me to Fredonia and leaves me and brings my clothes with me. And then that there was no question of her getting custody, because my dad, he just said, you take what you've got and go, and I won't fight you for custody. But he said, I'm going to have it. And of course, she was ready to go. She was ready to travel. And so she just took off, went to Indianapolis to her mother's, and then her and this girl went out to California, and that's where she met Bob. And then I didn't even see her maybe it'd be years. Maybe I'd see her not even once a year. Not even once a year. And but see, I was used to staying with Pa and Minnie Ma a lot, and they had, of course, I thought it was really nice because they had JC had a bedroom, and they had a bedroom, and then they had what you'd call now a entry hall or something that was kind of big. They had a couch out there, and I mean, it was big enough that when they built, redid the house, they put a bathroom. We didn't even have a bathroom till I was in high school. So I lived in a different generation, even though I was, and I lived more in my grandparents' generation than I did in my friends' generation. But that was a good town because everybody was so good to me, and they still are. And but anyway, I knew that they were not going to be together anymore. But nobody ever told me. Nobody ever sat down and says, well, we're going to get a divorce, this, that, and the other, because people didn't talk about that then. And then there was a lot of animosity there. And and my mother, she didn't want to have a child, and she didn't want to be tied down. She was a kid herself. She was 16 when she got married, and the reason she got married was because she was pregnant. And so her mother was up in Indiana, and she lived with her grandparents. It was sort of the same cycle. I'm glad we broke it a little bit. I don't know. And I think that, I'm just going to say this, and you take it out or leave it. And that's why it hurt me so bad when Tom and Nancy got a divorce. It's why I can't accept it. Once you've accepted all those things and got through them, you don't want to go back again and revisit it. And I see Braden's out there, and it's kind of like in some ways I was living my own life over again, and I didn't like it the first time, but by the second time I was verbal about it, and I was more, I guess, ugly about it. And it didn't do any good, but still, I wanted to say my piece, and I did. Well, let me tell you what. So anyway, when I went to live with them, and of course JC was still in high school, and I was in, I guess I was getting ready to go in the second grade. I think this all happened in the middle of a year, but anyway, Katie Perkins lived next door, and she was my teacher. And so she made it just real easy, just like I'd been there forever, because she knew a lot about me anyway. JC, though, he was the baby, and he was spoiled. And of course, they had always spoiled me when I was there, kind of, because I was the first grandchild. So we all, and Danita said she didn't even know this, but, we heated our house with wood and coal, because we didn't have gas heaters, or we didn't have electric heaters, or we didn't have furnaces. So at night, we had our main meal at noon. My grandmother cooked on a wood burning stove. We heated with coal and things. And when I tell these things now, it sounds like I was in the dark ages, but that was just the way it was back then. And so JC and I would go, we'd bank the fire in the kitchen, and then we kept all the house shut up. So we basically lived in one room when we got ready to go to bed at night. And JC slept in the next room. He had to move over, but my grandmother slept. All of us slept in the same room. My pa slept in the big bed. I guess was his and Minnie Mau's, the one that if it fell on you, it would kill you. It was one of those big high-topped antique beds with a big roll at the top and a big roll at the bottom. And when you got in it and it squeaked and you'd think, oh God, that thing's gonna fall down and I'm gonna be smashed right in there like a sandwich between those two things. But he slept by himself in that bed. And my grandmother had a little rollaway bed that she slept in by herself. And then I slept in this one bed, and it was I wished I'd got that bed. It was one of those pretty antique beds with the iron rail, foot and headboard. But that's where JC and I, when we would go in there, we listened to radio. We listened to Father Knows Best. That was and then One Man's Family. I mean, there were serials that were on the radio. And of course, we always had to listen to Walter Cronkite because that was the newsman. And Paul wouldn't let you listen to anything till you watched the news. And he found out what was going on in this tremendous world that he never really got to see much of and didn't want to see much of, really. But so anyway, my grandmother had a bedspread on that bed. And it was brown. It was not attractive, but it was kind of like a knit one. It had brown stripes and white stripes. And JC and I would lay over there when we were reading the paper, doing our homework, doing whatever we were doing. And he'd say, now this is my stripe and you can't go past it. And you know what? I was contrary back then, I guess. And so as soon as I'd see him, I'd put my foot over there. And he would get so mad. Mom, she's doing this, she's doing that. Of course, he never said to Paul, because Paul would say, you leave her alone. I was his honey bird. But, I think about how many times, we would get into almost knockdown, drag out, because I was determined that I was going to get my foot over in his part. And he was determined that I was not going to get 1 inch over it. I was short. It hit him right in the knees. I don't know what. But anyway, that was every night we went through it. Every night. And then it wasn't even his bed. It was my bed because he slept in the other room, but they didn't build a fire in there. So he had to go in there and get under that mountain of covers. You used to have a mountain of covers. You couldn't tell if anybody was in bed because they had like 7 blankets and quilts, those old quilts. Remember those old quilts? You know those because we brought some home with us that were probably about 2 inches thick, but they were not fluffy quilts. They were hard. If you got there, you couldn't hardly turn over with them on you. And so, and then JC when he graduated, he went to work for my dad up in the mountains in the road construction business. He came home maybe 3 or 4 times a year. During that time, I didn't really spend a lot of time with him. He just kind of dropped me off, and there I was. And but I had Minnie, Ma, and Pa, and I had my old maid's aunts, Carrie and Debbie, great aunts next door, and my Uncle Ray, and they all thought that I was the best thing since bottled beer. They let me do anything I wanted to almost, except I couldn't be disrespectful to adults, and I couldn't go out of my yard to play. And I could not be anything but a perfect lady. If I'd stuck my finger up to somebody, they would have probably all had a heart attack. But I wasn't that forward then. So anyway, that's where I spent my time from the time I was in the 2nd grade until I was going into my sophomore year of high school. So I was kind of used to it. My grandfather, he taught me a lot. He was a smart man. He also was a ticket agent for the L&N Railroad. That's what he started his career with. And because he believed in family and he believed families ought to stick together, and I guess that's how they ended up keeping me. Him and his brother, when he got out of the military, they started the garage, and they ground meal for people. They ground feed for animals. They had a big grinding section in the back. It covered about 2 city blocks, one across and one back. and they had a garage. They had a chicken and egg. My Uncle Ray would go out to all the farmers, and he bought chickens and eggs. Then we'd come home and we'd candle those eggs to make sure they were clean and, inside. I never wanted to candle another egg in my life after I left there. And so they made they made a pretty good living. And then Paul was the depot agent, because the depot was just across the street from the garage. So he didn't have to keep it open. Everybody just come and get Mr. John if they had a package. And we got to ride the railroad free to Memphis every summer and see my aunt. And I loved going there. She and her husband didn't have any children, and they thought I was the best thing since bottled beer. They were so good to me, and took me places that I didn't get to go. I went to the Cotton Carnival in Memphis. I went to the zoo. I went to the fairgrounds. I thought they had no children up at that point when I was first going down there. And then after I was old enough, when Patsy was born, that I kind of could boss her, so I didn't mind having the competition. They finally had 3 daughters. It wasn't really bad. And people were real good to me. Everybody knew us in Fredonia. They were well thought of, my grandparents. And I had my old maid aunts and uncle next door, and they thought I was the best thing since bottled beer. So I don't mean for it to sound like it was all bad. It wasn't. But when you're out of a situation that you just thought was a normal situation, nobody ever talked to you about it. I think I always talked too much to my kids because I wanted them to know what the reasons were for things that happened. And that's the way they are. I think I always try to say that's the way they are, but you need to know why and what you can do for yourself about it. And we had a 5-room house. We had coal stove heat. We did have a gas range, but because my grandmother liked to have a cooking stove, we also had a cooking stove this was back in the late 40s, I guess. And we did have a cooking stove that we cooked on, that you put wood into, because that's the only thing that would bake pies like she liked them. A gas stove, you couldn't regulate it, she said. Well, a long time ago, more than I like to think about now, I was born here about, now it's been 84 years ago. But where I spent the most of my life up until I was a teenager was 2 houses up here. And my grandmother and I, we didn't go much, but we sat on the front porch a lot. And we saw everybody that went up and down the street. But the one thing that we saw was we never came down here a lot, but we would be able to hear everything that went on. They had rodeos down here. They had ball games. My dad played ball here when he was a young man. They had just all kind of activities at the ballpark. But the one that I remember most of all, because it was the only place in town that had a big, nice sound system, was when they had the Holy Roller meetings down here. And they preached down here on the ball field, and we could sit on the porch and we could see them clapping and singing. And sometimes they fell out when the Lord just took hold of them, and they fell out. Then the next time that we would sit up there on the porch, we kind of heard some things that weren't quite in the same light, because we heard people hollering at the ball players and at the umpires. But it was, I guess we didn't have a television set. It was like television is to kids, today. We got to see all the good, the bad, and the ugly by sitting on the porch and looking at the ballpark. And you remember some things before they redid this ballpark we were talking about was my dad.
Yeah, we was talking a few minutes ago, me and Joanne, and I used to come down here with Paul Butts, and we're probably in the neighborhood of 150 feet from his house. And I grew up here, and I grew up in this ballpark, and Paul Butts used to come down here and he'd watch me play ball, and we was sitting on the benches playing ball one day, and he said, he said, Willie, he called him Willie, and then he'd say Willis, and he couldn't make up his mind what he wanted to call him, but anyway, he'd say Willis. He said, Willis could have been a pro ball player. He said he used to get up, and every time he got up to bat, that all the black folks over here on, as we used to call it, nigger row, would start hollering, hit me the ball, Mr. Willie, hit me the ball. And he'd never fail. He'd drive it plumb over the fence and 50, 75 yards past and lose the ball. But yeah, I remember that. And I remember the summer festivals. I remember when y'all used to come in, and Dee and Mike and all y'all, and we'd have the summer festivals. Me and Dee was talking about it the other night. They had a grease pole. You'd have to climb that pole to get the $10 bill off the top of that pole. Of course, we all had grease all over us, but we never got that $10 bill. And I think we chased a grease pig that day too. But Marty and Tommy and them were little bitty, and they rolled in the dirt and just had a big time. But that's a whole lot of what I remember at this ballpark.
Yeah. Well, as I said, we didn't get to go out much. So I guess it was our TV and we were sitting in the arena, we thought, watching all the things that went down here. But most of all, it was about the only place that they had any public activities during that time. They'd have just things that us country folks thought was really uptown doings. And I'm looking at it today, and it's even nicer. But I remember when they built it, and they built this, I call it a watchtower over here. That's what I always thought of when you went up the steps. And that was the neatest thing. We'd bring our bikes down here, and we'd ride around the ball field. It's laid out as a ball field. And then we'd get up there and peer down at our kingdom here in this old Fredonia Valley. And it's one of my best girlfriend lived next door to me, June Perkins. And we thought and it wasn't very far from my house, but my grandparents were a little bit of controllers, and I couldn't get too far away from them. So we had the opportunity to, come all the way down to the ballpark, which is maybe, 500 feet, a couple of 100 yards, I don't know. But that was a good time for us. And I think about now, as my children, all the places that they've been to and all the things they've seen before they were hardly 10 years old. And I think, I wonder what they would have thought of the ballpark. Wonder if they would have thought it was unique as I did.
We've had a good day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Been to the graveyard.
And we haven't even had an argument yet. We have to do that before it's
close time, okay.
Yeah, he was my first competition, when for me and Mom and Pa, because he got to stay with them all the time, like I did. The other grandchildren didn't have that opportunity, so
we was blessed by it, though.
Oh, we were.
So.
We really were.
I think so.
I think every day I think of something that they taught me or that I learned from them that in a different setting I probably wouldn't have. So I think that's been good. Everything's for a reason, and I think that was for the reason that I've been able to come today and do all this thing. Because one thing they taught me to be was a tough old bird.
What was it you said? Worked hard to do what?
Yeah.
What?
Well, my grandmother, my pa, he was kind of, I could get by him. He was a little easy. But my grandmother said, I don't care what, you're going to have to work legs or give milk. So you decide what you're going to do. And I decided, I guess I'd have to work. And I've been working ever since. They ever tell you that? No, yeah. You were the favored child.
No,
here.
I can't help I was a boy.
He can't help it. He was a boy, and that was wonderful. When you have a son, that was wonderful. And he's a good boy. And I love you, Ricky.
Love you, sweetie.
But I'm glad I got to get married and change my name, because I got teased about that so much.
I learned to fight at a young age.
Well, you would, because I thought I'm gonna get married at 17. As long as it's something Smith, anything. Wayne just happened to have a good German name. I never had any brothers and sisters. When I came to live with my grandparents, I just finished the first grade, but I'd been there so much it was just a normal thing for me to be back here. But you know what? They had a baby at the house who was probably about 16, maybe 15 or 16. And I think he wanted to stay the baby. And then here I came along, and I was a girl and I was the baby. And so Paul always made, the boys always had to give up to the girls. And I'm going to tell you, I thought at the time that he was the meanest guy in the world. We had a bed in our back room. You all probably call them dens now, but anyway, we called it the back room. We listened to the radio back there because we only had one radio, no TV. And we would share this little bed while we were reading or studying or doing whatever. And it had stripes down the bedspread, brown and white. Ooh, we could have had a prettier color, but it wasn't. And he thought that the bed belonged to him. And my grandmother said, no, she can lay down on there too. You all can both do your work there. Because, you know, she was wanting me to work all the time. And he would put his foot over on my line every single solitary time. Every single night he would do that. And I would whine and I would cry. So Paul would say, now, JC, quit aggravating her. Quit aggravating her, JC. And the minute he turned on, oh my Lord, we listened to Father Knows Best on the radio, and the squeaking door, and all those really great radio shows. But in the middle of it, I'd be screaming out, get your foot off of my line. That's my line over here. And you know what? He did that to me my whole life. Even after I had children, he would aggravate me to death. And I guess that's how I learned, even though I was an only child, what an aggravation older brothers could be. So, but I got him back later on because I had a whole bunch of kids and I'd bring them down here to aggravate him, and which they did. Which they did. But it was all good times. And sometimes when you're in the middle of good times, you don't even realize that they're good until it's too late. So I want everybody to remember what the real good times are. It's not coming to the ball game. It's the memories that you made when you came here. It's not having an aggravating older brother or sister. It's how much you love each other up until the day you die.
Now, was Sis gone when you?
Yeah, sister was married. In fact, when I moved here, she and Glenn were living in Galveston, Texas. He was in the Coast Guard, I guess, and that was around the World War II time. Well, she didn't have a convertible, but she had one of those little cars that the tail part of it set back and had two seats in it.
Rumble seat.
Oh my Lord, I thought those rumble seats were made just for me because they were little. I don't think I could get in one now, but they were made little, and it was fun. That was just my little private place there. And then, of course, they never moved back to here. They went from the Galveston to Memphis, Tennessee. And she was my sister, my mother, my aunt, everything good. Sister was to me.
I was thinking you'd said that once to me before, so you felt like more
everything good came from her, and I appreciate it so much. So it's been kind of a fun time to come back down here this week, and thank you all so much for running us all over the world to get to all. Heck, I didn't know it was so far down. I just thought it was this town was the size of a teacup. Well, we've been in a whaling vessel this weekend, but I'm glad I had the opportunity. We all need to look forward to what's going to happen. Good things are going to happen, but we kind of need to look back on our roots and where we came from and what made us the people we are today. So even though I had to work, lay eggs, or give milk, even though I had a uncle that worried the beewinkle out of me, and
wouldn't change nothing.
I wouldn't. I was blessed. I was so blessed. And sometimes you have to be far beyond that to realize how blessed you are to have people who love you and people you love, have people that aggravate you and people you aggravate. The worst thing I guess he ever did to me was he wanted the room. My grandmother, when I got big enough to move to another room, and I didn't have to sleep in the same room with her and Paul anymore, I got the front room. And that was the cream of the crop in our little house up there. And JC had the room that was next to my grandmother and grandfather. And I didn't realize at the time, but I think that that's so they would know what time he came in. And at that point, it didn't matter. I didn't get to go anywhere, so I didn't go anywhere. And so the story goes that the man they bought the house from, which was a Judge Kennedy, he was kind of an odd guy, and he committed suicide in that bedroom. And JC would come home from a date, 10 o'clock, I think was his deadline at the time. And he would come home, and of course I'd already been in the bed for 2 hours. 8 o'clock was Paul's bed at that time, and everybody had to like that whether they wanted to or not. And he would come into the bedroom there, and I would be about half asleep, and he would say, "This is the ghost of old Judge Kennedy. I've come to get you." And he thought that he was going to scare me out of that room. But he didn't know it. The Buttses are all hard-headed as they can be. And I thought, I don't care if you are old Judge Kennedy. I'm going to keep this room. I'm not going to let JC have it. And I did keep the room. And then he finally had to marry and move out, so he got his own room. One of the things I remember about JC, though, that JC was working for the prison. And my children went to a school called Sayre School in Lexington. And they had some really nice friends. They were good kids, all of them. And I worked at the police department, so I knew, the good and the bad about Lexington. So anyway, one day, a young boy that I had seen, him and his sister, him and his family, in the wait line. We had a wait line when you picked your kids up from school. And they picked him up one day from school, and he had a sister. And they went home. His father was a minister. His mother was very active in women's church activities. And they went home, and just for whatever strange reason, these fellas had escaped from the jail, or from the courthouse. They were up there being tried in court. And this is hard to talk about. They went to the house of the Barneses. Their name was Barnes. And they were kind of long-time criminals. And they went to the house. And just how that happened, I don't know. They were in such close proximity to where Sayre School was. The courthouse was in front of it. And they had a daughter and a son. And the little boy had his football uniform on. And they broke in the house, and the father was there. And they murdered them heinously. Heinously. It was terrible. And it was so traumatic when you're a teenager and people that you see every day, and you think about it, you read it in the paper, but until it affects you personally, you can't imagine what it's like. So JC was working at the prison, and they were sentenced to prison, but it could never change what they had done to these people. All of them. The mother wasn't there, but the father and the rest of them died. JC was going to transport them from the prison back up to court again. They had to come to court again. And I got so upset, and I thought they were the most heinous people that I had ever heard of, much less, and he had to transport them. And I'm going to tell you what, I threatened every policeman that I knew up there. I even notified people in the state police that I knew that was along the route to really watch out for him, because JC, he talked like it, but he wasn't scared of a thing in the world. And I thought he'd think he could probably transport them without even binding them up. So I realized then, I guess, how much he meant to me, and how, like the older brother that I always wished I had, an older brother or sister or somebody besides me, how much it meant to me when I feared for him. And I think that, if I recall correctly, there was an officer that said, "That's okay, I'll make sure that nothing happens." And I don't know how he put the fear of God in those outlaws, but obviously he did, because nothing happened. He didn't have any trouble getting them there, any trouble coming back. But I knew then that blood's thicker than water, and that I probably, tell you the truth, I kind of tattled on him all the time. So I probably deserved what he did to me, but I didn't think I did. I mean, I was a sweet little girl, so I didn't think I did.
So I think I do remember that JC came out of the house while we're talking. Not word for word, but I think he pretty much told me that he was going to be all right. Because he pretty much told him, "I dare you to make one move, because it'll be your last move. There's not a quarter. I'll probably get a medal."
I think you're right.
And I remember thinking, he'll be fine.
Yeah. Well, you know, I told you he thought he could handle everything, whether he could or not. He made you believe it. He made you believe it.
But I do remember that. Because you were so worried about him.
Oh, I was.
And it was such a bad time for all of us.
Yeah, we had, you know, in a small, even though we lived in Lexington, which was a big city, it's a small community, your section is, and those were special people to us. The headmaster's son had played ball for Wayne, so it wasn't like it was just sort of in a normal atmosphere that we would know them and not know them well. And I had seen the little girl that drove her car home that day to her father being killed. Her little brother had his football uniform on, and they made him put his head in the commode and they shot it. And of course there's the atrocities that they left those 3 family members dead in that house. And so yeah, I was afraid. I thought they were the devil reincarnated. I sure didn't want him, yeah. I sure didn't want him to be affiliated or associated with them. And so I was pretty upset during, well,
for me, it worried me about you, but for me, your dad was always working. So I always thought that JC was a
you thought nothing could touch him.
I thought he was working.
Did your dad talk about transporting you?
Never told me.
Did you talk about any?
Oh yeah, we talked about it a lot in the prison and different things, but it didn't worry him. He walked the yard like he was 10 foot tall. He didn't think a thing about it. His office was in the middle of the yard, and that's where they have access to all the convicts. Had access to walk in his office at any time, and never fazed him. He never worried about none of it. I just know it was a good job, but it was a bad job, and Daddy was a guy that was cut out for it. You know, I think he was, and I want to think, didn't he? When you come down, did you sit in the electric chair?
Well, that was when I was a little.
I wasn't.
That was when I was a real little girl. My mother's grandfather, who raised her over here in Dykesburg, Kentucky, he was there when they built that prison. He was working there, and I don't know why he thought this would be something to, special. But I think I was about 4 or 5 years old. It was before my parents divorced, and so he took us all over there when they were finishing up, and they had just installed the electric chair. And I don't know if he thought he was giving us a lesson. You better shape up or you might be ending up over here in this seat. But it wasn't a women's prison, so I figured it was for the boys. But anyway, we all sat in the electric chair. So he said, now someday, I didn't know it would be particularly anything of interest, but I sat in the electric chair at the Eddyville State Penitentiary when I was 4 years old. So that was 80 years ago.
Well, that part of it still is a man's prison. The other part out here is a women's prison.
Yeah.
But Dad was responsible for the electric chair when he took that job. He had to keep it functioning.
Yeah, because he was the engineer over there, wasn't he?
Overall electrical engineered part of it, and he had to.
While we're talking about that, I don't know if you remember this, but JC lived on the prison grounds or in a house right across from the prison. And I came down here to Paducah to a PTA convention. And so I said, well, let's go by and see my uncle. He works over here at Eddyvale State Penitentiary. And you know, sometimes PTA people, they're just little quiet mothers of children and they don't get out much. I was an exception to that rule. But anyway, we go over there and I said, and you all had a houseboy named Chuck.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a trustee that could work there because it was on the prison grounds. And Chuck was a character. He wasn't a vicious criminal, but he was a character. But anyway, so we pulled up, and of course I knew Chuck. I mean, I'd been there before, and he was always good as gold to me and my kids and everybody. So we pull up, and I have these little timid PTA women. They had not had the experience I'd had in life. And they were just looking at the prison like, oh my God, oh my God. And I said, there's a man out there on the porch sweeping the porch. And I said, oh, is that your uncle? And I said, no, it's Chuck. And they said, oh. I said, well, he's kind of their houseboy. Well, I didn't go into anything more about it. So when we get in and we're in there, and so he comes in and he acted just like he lived there. He said, now, can I get you ladies something to drink? Can I get you something to eat? Well, they just thought he was the nicest thing ever was. And then JC comes in, and he had a quirky sense of humor. And he said, oh, have you all met Chuck? And they said, oh, yes, he's been so nice. I said, well, you know, said he's over here for murdering and raping women. And Chuck said, oh, don't say that, Mr. Butts, don't say that. And they're like, oh! So you can see he was full of the devil. No matter how old he was full of the devil. Even if he did save me a time or two.
And he was in for forgery, though.
I know, paper. Then he told him he was in for paper hanging, and they said, do what? So yeah, I remember that. He was a good guy. He was a good guy. My mother's people lived. Her dad was killed before she was even born, and I don't know whether this is the truth or not, but this is the most story I could ever get out. Supposedly, he was a gambler on my Papa Vosier's boat, showboat thing that went down the river, and he wasn't doing right. And somehow or other, he fell over into the paddle wheel and got killed. And it was never talked about at all. So as I got older and I questioned more, I thought, something ain't right about this, but I don't know. I have no idea. Never heard the man's name. And Inez would absolutely not talk about it. Inez was my mother's mother. And she was a character in herself. But she married again, and she left my mother with her parents, just like my dad and mother did. And she went to Indianapolis, Indiana, got a good job at Fort Benjamin Harrison, and raised 3 outlaws and 1 lovely daughter. She married a guy by the name of Rob Barrick, and they had 4 children. I guess she did okay. You know, he died kind of early, but she worked for Fort Benjamin Harrison, and that time made good money. I used to go, she'd work nights sometimes, and when we'd go up to visit her, I was just a little thing. My mother and I'd go up, she'd leave me with her there for a while, and she didn't want to get up in the morning. So I got up one day, and I was wanting to find my mother, and I took my mother's picture and started walking down the street there in Indianapolis from where they lived. And these 2 little girls that lived in one of the houses along there said, where are you going? I said, I see this woman, I'm looking for her. Said, I need to find her. And I had her picture. In fact, I think I've still got that picture here. She had on like a suit or something, a brown suit. So they called, there were policemen on the street then, you didn't have to flag them down in a car. And he said, is that your sister? And they said, no, she lives so-and-so. So he took me back home, and he took the picture back home. And of course, he had to get my grandmother up, so that was a little touchy. I didn't know it. I thought I really liked him. He was so nice. He was trying to help me find Mama. I don't think I ever called her Mama. I think I always called her Mother. And so anyhow, I didn't find her, and no telling where she was either. But she didn't really live there. But I guess I just was thinking I needed to see her, and I just could walk out of the house and go find her somewhere. But I think about those kids, how, we think that they don't have too much sense, but they had enough sense to get a policeman there and turn me over to him. So it was a real sporadic life. And then when I lived with my grandparents, they were really too old to raise a child, but they were good. And the JC went to service, and his wife and her sister, while he went to Germany, and they were real good to me. They treated me so good. They took me swimming with them. They kind of let me have what kind of a normal household life I would have. And me and Mom and Pa were kind of glad. They were old. They didn't know what to do with raising another kid. And according to Sister, my aunt, she said, and then Sister came. Her husband was overseas, and she came and lived with us about 3 years while I was there. And she was my joy of my life. I miss her so much. She was laughing all the time, no matter what was going on. She just says, you just laugh your troubles away. And she was good at it. She was really good at it. But she had a car, and I got to go places, and it wasn't all bad. It was good. But it's just such an erratic life. There's no symmetrical things in it. And I went up to live with my dad. His wife had a daughter just a little younger than me, and I was a pretty girl when I was young. And poor Edwina, she never did get pretty, did she? She was very jealous of, I don't know why my dad was never there. He was on the road all the time. But she wanted her to get all the attention when Daddy was there. And he didn't give anybody much attention. But, he did acknowledge that I was his daughter, and we had a longer relationship than Shinny. And Edwina she was kind of a pain in the ass, if I remember. And later, after she got married and got older, we were able to be congenial with each other. He was married 3 times, Mother and Helen and Nancy, yeah. Paul always brought his books home from the railroad on Sundays. That's the only day he didn't work. And I went to church with the people next door, the Perkins. They were good. They were good for me. They were really good. They were, there's a lot of kind people around. Don't ever miss a chance to be kind. Wayne used to get aggravated at me because I'd want to pick up every stray and do, and I said, well, I know how much it meant to me, But anyhow, Dave and Katie Perkins took me a lot of places. They had a daughter who was a year or two younger than me, and then they had 2 boys. Minnie Ma never went out of the house. She never shopped. I did the shopping. I walked downtown, do the shopping, bring it home. She never went anywhere unless Sister came, and then they didn't go anywhere in Fredonia. They'd go somewhere else. She didn't go next door to her. Now, Paul's mother and dad were dead before I, went to live with them. But Uncle Ray and Carrie and Debbie lived there. She never walked. She would talk to them over the fence, but she never walked up there. She was a real antisocial person as far as, she wasn't really mean. She just was not a social person. And I'm kind of a social person, so that created some problems with us. And then when JC married Wilma, and she had a sister that's kind of maybe there's about 5 or 6 years difference in Wilma and her sister, and so her sister was just a couple of years older than me. So she'd take us swimming over Katoa Springs, and we got to go to a movie occasionally. Now, Paul and Uncle Ray had a movie house down in Fredonia. And it was only on Saturday night, and it cost a dime to get in. And then but he ran the projection thing. So when I was in middle school, the boys couldn't sit on the same row with us, but they could sit behind us. And boy, if one of those boys got up close to my ear, was trying to whisper sweet nothings, he'd send somebody down there, tell him, move to the next row back. My grandfather met her. She had left home and was working at, well, it was like the boarding house where the people that worked at the railroad, the engine, they stayed up in Paducah, and that's where they met and married. My grandfather had an old truck, a real old truck, and it was for the garage. It was a flatbed, and it's what they stacked all the chicken coops on when they when Uncle Ray went out to pick up chickens and eggs and things. So we had to haul water because we had a cistern. And when it was dry, we'd go to Katoa Springs and haul water. Well, since he didn't have any boys at home anymore, I had to go with him. So and I think I was about 13 or 14 years old. And he said, you need to learn how to drive this truck in case you need to come over here and get water. And I thought, oh my Lord, of course, they were all it was the 4 in the floor with the bottom about to rot out of it. And it was a big truck. It was a flatbed, like a truck you'd haul stuff on. So we went over there, and they'd put this big water tank on there, and we'd go fill it up with water and bring it back, fill up the 2 cisterns. And so I learned how to shift the gears, had 5 speeds, 4 in the floor and then reverse. And I'd drive over there, and we were on a public highway. I didn't have a sign of a permit or anything. I think I was about 13. So he said, well, you need to learn to drive. So I learned to drive, but there were some things he failed to tell me. And my next door, the girl that lived next door, she had, Alice, Debbie's daughter, she gave me this book to come from the driver's place, about all the things you need to do, about learning the sign, brought me all those signs. So I had listed all that, but when we went over there was nobody, I could ask anything. And he would ride over on the other side, and he'd just kind of act like he was asleep or something. So we'd go over to the springs, and he'd put the water thing on, and we'd load up the tank. Then when you'd be going home, that tank of water's making your car move differently. So it kind of would scare you, and he said, well, you're going to have to get out of this, but you'd kind of tense up. And so one time we had a flat tire, and we were going down the hill. And I said, we're going to have a wreck. He said, no, you can't have a wreck. This is my only truck. You can't have wrecked this truck. And I didn't, but I guess it gave me a little bit of confidence. But that's how I learned to drive. And there was nothing easy about it, I will tell you. Nothing easy about it. I played a lot of games because I had these 2 great aunts that lived next door with Uncle Ray, and we played all kinds of games. So I had lots of social and lots of adult companionship. But I did have my mother's grandfather had built me a playhouse, and it was an exact replica. It even had a fireplace in it, and they brought it over on the truck and put it in between some buildings at Paw and Minnie Mouse. So I couldn't go anywhere, but I could have people there. And it was the biggest drawing thing. But June, the girl that lived next door to me, Miss Katie's daughter, she played over there with me. So I always had somebody to play with. And she was approved, because they do the Perkinses so well. They gave me so JC and I think there was a little bit of jealousy because he was the youngest and he had been at home with them and kind of had it. Well, then I moved in, and it kind of made him a little bit, she's infringing on my territory. You know how it's like brother and sister. We were probably like brother and sister, but I'd never had one, so I didn't know how to act. So they decided to give me what was the guest room, which was across the hall from his room, and it had a stove, a little warm morning stove in it, and his bedroom had a fireplace in it, and they didn't want me to have to deal with the fireplace. So I had this bedroom, and it was the best bedroom Uncle Ray had made my mother and daddy. He was a wonderful woodworker, and he had made them this bed. It was made out of cedar, and it was a high bed. And a cedar chest. He made a cedar chest. oh, I thought that was the greatest room in the world. But I had a fire stove in there, a little warm morning stove. And so JC's job was to clean the stove and keep the fire. Well, he'd bank it at night, and then in the morning he'd come over there. Well, he wanted that room because it was further away from my grandparents. I guess he thought he could sneak out or something. I don't know. So anyway, but I loved it. And sister come down and helped me fix it up, and I just loved it. And he would come in from a date or something, because by that time he was driving and had his car, and was working, and he'd come in from a date, and he'd come to the door of my room. He'd say this, and the people that owned that house before my grandfather and them was a judge in his family. His name was Judge Kennedy. And he said, and he had committed suicide there, and in the room I was in. Well, I wasn't afraid. I wanted that room so bad I didn't care. But anyway, JC would come to my door, and I'd be asleep, and he'd say, "This is the ghost of old Judge Kennedy." He said, "I'm going to come for you for getting my room." He wanted that room so they couldn't hear him come in. So that was kind of a funny. So I told him I'd never forget old Judge Kennedy, because I was scared to death, but I wasn't about to agree to give him that room. I was going to stay in it. If Judge Kennedy come to visit me every night of the world, I was going to stay in there and get that best room in the house. And it was, it was good. They were good to me. They were very, very strict, and I think they kept thinking I was going to be just like my mother. Grandparents don't need to raise children. Too many. I don't need to raise mine. There's too many years between. There's too many changes in there, and they've earned their time to be by themselves. But I went down, took care of my grandmother when she died. I took the kids, and we'd go and stay a week, and I cleaned. Oh my Lord! When his brother moved in with him, he moved in with him and rented out his house after everybody was gone. The two of them lived there. And every summer I would drag these kids down there, and I would get Laura. She was a black lady that lived over there and had worked for my grandmother. And so her daughter was about my age, and I would get them to come over, and we would house clean. And I thought, oh my God, this has got to be I thought if anybody ever came in there, this is the nastiest house. They'd come in from working in the garden. They wouldn't take their shoes off. Sometimes the dirt would be that deep on the floor, and I'm not kidding. It would be. But you know what? It was the way they wanted to live. They took care of themselves. And I'd say, why don't you get Laura to come over here and clean up for you once a month? Because, it was a job. It was a job to go down there. And they did have the lady that did their laundry, and Pa cooked. And I'd say, no, I'm going to cook while I'm here, because there is no telling how long it'd been that he had not cleaned out some stuff. So I said, I'm going to, and I did, though, every summer. The kids and I'd go down there. I'd take off work, and we'd go down there. And sometimes Wayne would go with us. He said, I can't hardly stand it. But we'd go, and then after it was just Pa, he just stayed in one room just about, so it wasn't bad. And Uncle Ray come up here one time and stayed with us a week. And they were good to me. It was just that it's hard for other generations to raise, kids, and then they despised my mother, which, I can kind of understand. If somebody did my grandchildren that way, I'd despise them too. But they should never have married. Her and Daddy should never have married. They were way too young, and my mother was too young when she died, because she always wanted to be the queen of the castle. And the last old man she married, she was queen of the castle. He had lots of money. My old maid aunts, we played next door. We played every kind of game. We played card games. We were big card game players. We played carom. Do you all know about carom? That's the board that has the pockets in it, and you shoot those things across. They play a lot of things on it. You can play a pool game, but you had these little round wooden hoops, and I was good at that. I was real good at that. I had a lot of blessings. And my great-grandfather, Lucian Bozier, was a talented man. He was a singer. He was He was a riverboat man, but he was the best carpenter. Him and his brother, they could build anything in the world. I mean, anything. And they built me a playhouse. And I had been to Florida with Mother and Daddy. That's the longest we ever lived together. Daddy was working on, during World War II, they had to go down and work on, blacktopped all the, because there were so many planes flying in and out for the war. And, we went down there and we stayed over a year. And I like to think that was the best time of my life with my parents, because Mother, she met some people down there, but it wasn't the same people she ran with. And a lot of them were like us. They were down there with the military, and they were good people. They just were kind of transits at the time. But we rented a duplex from this lady because you couldn't find a place to live during the war. It just was, they didn't have. And so we lived in this little duplex, and the woman who owned it had a handicapped child. He was a grown man, but he was handicapped. And so she was real good to me, and he could play. He could not see, but he could play the piano out of this world. And in fact, he taught me a little bit about playing chords and things, and he'd let me play with him, and I really did enjoy that. And but Daddy worked real hard back then. But my mother had a bunch of people that we went to the beach almost every day. That was a good time. I liked that. But I was so sick when I got back. They had to take me to Paducah to the doctor. I didn't have enough blood in me. I was real anemic, and my hair started falling out. And it was just where, she didn't cook or anything. And so we picnicked at the beach and I got real run down. So that's when my grandmother and grandfather really got mad. And then she wouldn't stay there, their house, or stay over there in Fredonia. She wanted to be somewhere else. And then, so we stayed in Marion. And then my dad, most of the roads he built was up in eastern Kentucky, till Daddy quit and went to work for Wilson Machinery. I guess maybe sometimes at some time in your life you have to go through some bad things, and I just got mine over with maybe, pretty fast. Then I had all these kids who didn't know nothing about birth control. And then I met Wayne, who was a man in a million. Of course, I'd raise hell with him all the time. That's how I kept him straight. Wayne's life is really similar to mine in a lot of ways, because his parents were divorced. His dad had a drinking problem. His mother was traveling all over the world she had a couple, 3 husbands too, just like mine. But it kind of let us see what we didn't want to do. Well, we wanted more than one child. I mean, obviously, we were both only children, and we realized that when you reach a certain stage in your life, your parents are gone, your grandparents are gone. If you don't have a real tremendous extended family, which we didn't, then now that Wayne's gone, I just have my children. That's it. And my grandchildren I love them dearly, but they haven't been this long road with me yet. And so we decided when Wayne was so tickled when he found out Mike was going to be a boy, because for some reason or other, I haven't figured this out, is that men always want to have a son, but they spoil their daughters rotten. Now, have you ever noticed that? They do. I mean, they're the love of their life. But anyway, so of course we had to. I didn't want to have a junior. I think for me, I said, I want him to be his own person, and I like the name Mike. So we named him after Wayne, Michael Wayne Wylie. And he's got a lot of traits of his daddy's. I laugh and tell him sometimes it's the ones I didn't like, but it's okay. And then when Danita came along, I thought that I should name her after my mother. And I didn't want to name her Christine after Wayne's mother. So I really wanted to name her after my aunt that I love so much, Juanita. So I took the D from Doris, my mother's name, and added the Nita to it. So that's how she got Danita. And I hadn't really known anybody with that name, but and then Joyce was just kind of, it went together. I just practiced till it went together. That's not named after anybody. That just kind of sounded right together. And then when Marty came along, of course, my dad had never had a son, and we didn't know we were going to have another, and we didn't know we were going to have 4 children. So I thought my dad would really love to have, his name was Willis, William Willis. And I thought, well, I would like to name him after Daddy. Because my dad we didn't always get along, but he was the one rock in my life. I mean, I knew I could always depend on him. He always came back. He wasn't an affectionate person. He wasn't anybody who I could sit down and tell my troubles to, but he was the rock that was there. And he thought money cured everything, and it doesn't, but it does help sometimes when you're raising a family. So I named him Willis, and his Martin just went together, because he's a Marty for sure, but his name's Willis Martin. Well, Thomas was Wayne's middle name. He was Wayne Thomas. So we named him Thomas. That kind of meant that's the last one we've run out of names. And you know what? Mitchell wasn't anybody that we knew, but it just kind of sounded right together. We tried some names. So hopefully they'll remember the people that they were named after, or the people that meant a lot to us, that we were willing to, give them their names to carry on. And so that's what we did. It sounds like that everybody has good points and bad points in their life, and that's what creates the people that we become. And I think I've had more good than I have bad. But I think that when you have the bad, it creates a reason for you to watch what you do and how you treat other people. And I've tried to do that. I really have. And then when you have the good, that's what keeps you going. You realize that even in the worst of times, there was some good times. And I guess I wanted to do this because the boys, of course, would never want to hear all this rigmarole. But what happens is when you lose somebody that you've had, and wasn't the best mother in the world. I wasn't the best wife in the world. I'm a pretty good grandmother. But there's only one perfect person, and of course we crucified him. So I didn't want to be crucified. So I thought I had to throw some. But I will have to say that the first 20 years of my life, or 18 or 20, it took us a couple of years to kind of get out some. We're tough. And I think that's what made me a little tough. So then when the bad things came later, I was able to handle them. I was able to, I didn't go to pieces. I kind of said, okay, you have to move on because there's something better at the end of the road. And there was. I've raised 4 beautiful children, got a whole pass of grandchildren that are just not perfect, but I like them pretty good. And Wayne and I had not a perfect marriage, but a marriage filled with love. And that's all that anybody ever needs in this world. You can say what you want to. We never had much money. But you know what? We had each other, and sometimes I was ready to throw him out the door, and I know he was ready to throw me out a time or two. But we'd both been thrown out before, and we knew that wasn't what we wanted to do. So we worked it out. And I've been blessed. I'm just sorry that he didn't get to stay with me as long as I got to stay with my children, and I'm blessed about that. And it's every life is different. There's turmoil in everybody's life, but I thank you, God, for bringing me to this place, and for maybe the experiences is what makes me be appreciative of it.